We received a case that seemed routine. An adult man found without clear signs of an accident. But there was one small detail at the scene that didn't fit the initial version, and that detail changed everything we thought we knew. What seemed like a simple case turned into one of the most baffling of my career. Before I begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it's reached. My name is Esteban Mendez. I'm 39 years old, and I'm a forensic doctor here in Guadalajara, Mexico. I've been examining bodies for over 15 years, looking for answers in what others see only as tragedy. And although you might think that over time you've seen it all, every case has its mystery, and sometimes that mystery can change the entire story. It was a day like any other when we received a report. A man, about 40 years old, found lifeless in his apartment. The initial signs showed no evidence of violence or visible accidents, and the death seemed natural. The body showed rigor mortis, but nothing out of the ordinary. However, something at the scene caught my attention from the very beginning. The deceased family had given a clear version. Their father had suffered a heart attack while watching television, nothing more. But upon entering the property, something made me doubt. The position of the body didn't match his sudden collapse, and there were objects out of place that didn't fit with that idea. In one corner, a fallen plant that seemed to have been knocked down recently, and a table with marks suggesting a fight. Also, the bedroom window was slightly open, strange for someone who lived alone and always kept everything closed out of caution. I also noticed a small dark puddle on the floor, which wasn't blood, but something else that raised many questions. The scene was clean, too clean for what we suppose had happened. I began to examine the body thoroughly in the morgue. The initial report suggested a heart attack, but some preliminary studies didn't fully convince me. The autopsy revealed something unexpected. Small internal injuries in vital organs, not visible to the naked eye but present in the heart muscle tissue and the trachea. They didn't seem compatible with a natural heart attack. While analyzing these findings, I asked the family about any recent conflicts. Minutes after they left the room with empty answers, I remembered a detail that had gone unnoticed. Some text messages on the deceased's phone that showed a dispute that might have escalated beyond words. I then decided to reconstruct the scene with a different approach. What if it wasn't a heart attack? What if someone was involved? I delved into the forensic evidence, reviewing every small trace, every stain, every fragment of evidence that others had overlooked. It was then that the small detail, the one that seemed insignificant to everyone else, changed the whole direction of the investigation. An almost invisible trail led me to discover that the man had been the victim of slow poisoning, a strategy designed precisely to simulate a natural accident. This case taught me that in forensic medicine there are no certainties without meticulous evidence, that the patience to keep digging into the darkest details can reveal the hidden truth behind an apparent tragedy. I want to tell you how that almost imperceptible detail led me to unravel the true story behind that man's death and how it changed me both as a professional and as a person. This is the story of my most baffling case, and of the power of observation has to miss nothing. We receive an apparently routine case, an adult man with no signs of an accident. But one detail at the scene did not match the initial version. Investigating patiently, I discovered the real sequence of events. I learned that meticulous observation and patience are more powerful than any protocol, and that the truth can always be found in the details. When I arrived at the place, a small house south of Guadalajara, the police had already secured the scene. Everything seemed to indicate a natural death or, in the worst case, a suicide. The official version, gathered by the officers, stated that the man had been found sitting in his living room, apparently calm, with no signs of external violence. At first glance, nothing to raise suspicions. However, something about the way the objects were arranged immediately caught my attention. It was not something I could easily put into words, but there was an almost imperceptible inconsistency in the scene. The low table in front of the man was clean, except for a half-consumed cup of coffee and an open book. I carefully approached to observe the cup. I noticed a thread of dried coffee dripping down one side, crossing an imperfect circle on the wood, as if someone had been there, leaning and nervous, and suddenly got up. The book seemed to have been open to a specific page, but someone had placed a bookmark slightly crooked, almost as if they wanted to hide that part or simply hadn't handled it carefully. I wondered what could be so important as to draw attention at that moment. While inspecting the body, external signs remained minimal. Nothing suggested a violent attack, no visible blows, nor piercing wounds. What I did notice was the almost complete stiffness of the hands and slight swelling on one of them, a swelling difficult to detect for an inexperienced eye. But for me, it triggered an internal alarm. Something was not matching the apparent calm. I carefully took the body to Forensic Institute's autopsy room, and that's where the investigation truly began. The autopsy revealed something contrary to what was expected. The body, apparently, did not die from natural causes or common substance abuse. Instead, toxicological analyses showed the presence of an uncommon but lethal chemical agent that exerted a paralyzing effect before causing organ failure. A silent poison that slowly paralyzes and causes a rapid death with no obvious external signs. How had that poison reached the man? Why, here was where the puzzle began to fit together. Delving into the deceased's background, I discovered he worked at a small chemical products factory in Guadalajara and had reported irregularities in material handling at his workplace. This led me to theorize a possible retaliation, but I needed concrete evidence. I visited the factory, spoke with colleagues, and found fear, silence, and evasiveness. Something was being concealed, and the scene at home appeared to have been manipulated to disguise the truth. The detail that obsessed me most was still the coffee cup and the open book. I returned to the scene several times with the police, searching for any clue that might give me another lead. Reviewing photos and mentally reconstructing the scene, I noticed another element, a barely visible mark, almost a scratch, on one of the table's legs. A very small damage that seemed to have occurred because of strong and sudden pressure, as if someone had pushed or pulled the table abruptly while trying something else. That made me imagine a silent struggle, a moment of tension no one wanted to admit. That idea made me request nearby security footage, cameras from neighboring businesses, to trace the man's last hours. There came the first unexpected twist. In a video from a store across his house, the man appeared speaking with someone else, a person who seemed upset, nervous, almost pleading. I couldn't clearly see the face, but the interaction seemed intense. That person hurriedly left just before the police arrived. It was the first visual proof that what was presented as routine actually had a much darker story. With that information, I focused on the deceased's life dynamics. There were problems not evidenced in the scene. Workplace conflicts, threats, possible blackmail. Every phone conversation I managed to recover, each testimony from an acquaintance, added layers to the real story. And the more I dug, the more puzzling it became. The hypothesis began to take shape. The death was neither accidental nor self-inflicted, but carefully orchestrated murder meant to go unnoticed. The poison had been expertly applied. Someone manipulated the scene to make it look natural, but the scratch on the table and the dried coffee stain told a different story. That of a last desperate fight to survive. Only a forensic expert who observes patiently, who understands every small detail, can discover it. I realized then that violence is not always shown in blows, but in what is hastily hidden or corrected. For days I reviewed everything. Every detail of the scene, police reports, testimonies, until a trivial detail turned on a bright light. The fingerprints on the coffee cup did not belong to the victim, but to another person close to him at work. A colleague who supposedly was not at the place, but whose alibi began to unravel. This man had access to the lethal chemicals and motives to silence the whistleblower. It was not a simple work conflict. It was a web of fear, betrayal, and silence. What came next was even more frustrating. Finding the suspect with the police was not easy. He had built a wall of lies and cover-ups among his colleagues. But the evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints on the cup, the presence of poison linked to the factory where both worked, and surveillance footage showing the final confrontation. When finally confronted, his reaction was a mixture of denial and extreme nervousness, a silence that spoke louder than 1,000 words. The conclusion was clear to me, and although the case went to the courts, the true lesson was much deeper. I was able to verify how a small detail, the dried coffee stain and a scratch on a table, could dismantle official versions and reveal a truth few would have imagined. In forensic medicine, it is not enough to follow a protocol to the letter. One must have a critical eye, the ability to read what is unwritten, and the strength not to give up in the face of shadows trying to camouflage reality. After months consumed by this case, I also understood that patience is not just waiting, but observing and allowing everything to make sense at the right moment. That discovering the truth is a meticulous, almost artisanal act in which every small piece can become fundamental. Today, when I reflect on this case, I still feel that chill of having been on the edge of what seems simple and discovering a complexity that changes everything. It became very clear to me that in my profession, I can never afford to forget the importance of details, nor lose the ability to listen to objects, scenes, and silences, because in them, even before anyone speaks, the truth we seek is already written. This most puzzling case not only taught me about poisons or manipulations, but about the very essence of my work. The truth is always found, but only by those who know how to look carefully and do not give up on what seems obvious. What happened from that moment on was a kind of shadow play between barely perceptible clues and silences heavy with secrets. The police increased surveillance at the factory and began discreetly questioning employees one by one, but the wall of fear and mistrust was palpable. No one wanted to talk. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to make the first move, fearing the consequences. Amid that tense atmosphere, I clung to the details that, though small, kept telling a growingly disturbing story. One night, while reviewing the toxicology results and photographs of the scene again, I cross-checked information almost mechanically, like trying to put together a puzzle without having a complete picture. It was in that process that I found a contradiction in the factory entry records. The co-worker, whose alibi seemed solid according to the initial investigations, had clocked in at an inconsistent time. That seemingly insignificant fact prompted me to request access to internal camera records that until then had not been thoroughly reviewed. When watching those recordings, I saw something that chilled my blood. At first, the footage showed the usual work environment, but at a specific moment, the suspect approached a restricted area. There, he handled a small bottle, carefully hid it in his pocket, and then left without anyone noticing. That area was where the most dangerous chemicals were stored, precisely the type of poison detected in the autopsy. This finding confirmed what I had already suspected, but also raised new questions. How and when was the poison applied, and whether someone else was involved? I then decided, with the help of some trusted agents, to reconstruct the scene at the factory, replicating possible situations to better understand that day's dynamics. We gathered several involved employees without telling them the exact hypothesis, and simulated schedules, movements, and routines. Among those tests, an interesting version emerged. That day, the accused had received an urgent phone call that upset him, and several co-workers noticed unusual tensions during his shift. Returning home, the picture became even clearer. The man had not been the victim of a spontaneous attack, but a meticulous plan devised by someone who knew how to hide their tracks. The sudden pressure that caused the scratch on the table leg now seemed the result of a brief but decisive struggle, perhaps when the victim, realizing what was happening, tried to defend himself or regain control of the situation. The dried coffee stain, previously only a curious detail, became evidence that the moment of the attack was not fleeting, but a defined period during which fear and despair filled that room. In the following days, the investigation became more complicated. The suspect behaved strangely, avoiding eye contact and giving evasive answers. Despite this, the evidence left no doubt. The cup with his fingerprints, access to the poison, the videos, and especially the damage of the scene formed a narrative as clear as it was disturbing. But something was missing, a piece that could unite everything definitively. It was then that I decided to delve into the digital world, a field that often reveals hidden secrets in conversations and movements that are more easily concealed in real life. I recovered messages from the deceased's phone, and among seemingly insignificant chains, a key conversation with the suspect appeared. A tense exchange, loaded with veiled threats and broken warnings. If you keep going down this path, there will be no turning back. One message said, beyond the text content. What struck me was the intent, the psychological pressure exerted by that man to make the victim desist from his complaints. It was more than a workplace conflict one comes to accept. It was a macabre game of power and fear, and that justified the extreme to which things had gone. But the most unexpected turn came when I cross-referenced those messages with the suspect's digital schedule. There was something unusual. Entries related to shipments, orders, and cancel requests for certain chemical products. One of those orders, curiously, matched the substance detected in the victim's body. Not only that, but the method for hiding the purchase of that poison was equally sophisticated. Disinfectant materials, apparently harmless products that actually concealed the toxic agent. It was not an improvised action, but a planned effort designed to go unnoticed by unsuspecting eyes. As the investigation progressed, I was able to do something that, in my experience, is always revealing. Spend some hours in the suspect's office, review his belongings and surroundings, respecting legal limits, of course, but always looking for clues that ordinary people tend to ignore. I found papers scribbled with confusing notes that, upon careful analysis, revealed a pattern. Constant references to that substance, calculations, dates, and plans that showed a clear intention. As if someone had become obsessed with a macabre plan and tried to control every part of it to the millimeter. After weeks of quiet and patient work, and despite external pressure, I was able to coordinate with the police the suspect's arrest. The detention was tense because he showed no remorse, only a veiled fear in every word and gesture. But the most disturbing aspect was a confession, which came only days later under the weight of the evidence. He admitted to the crime, the meticulous preparation to make it look like a natural death, and the manipulation of the scene to avoid suspicion. But what impacted me most was the motive he gave. Not only fear of losing his job, but paranoia that the victim might reveal secrets threatening several people inside the factory. From that moment on, many things began to clear up. Internal investigations were launched. Other employees started speaking out, and the web of complicity slowly unraveled. What seemed like a closed and silent environment began to show cracks, revealing a network of corruption, omissions, and threats. The case that began with an apparently simple scene turned into a reflection of how fear can turn ordinary people into pieces of a system that protects dark interests, risking lives and truths for convenience. I still reflect with some unease on how we were all, in some way, participants in that process. From the agents who secured the scene, through the staff who feared revealing what they knew, to myself, who had to learn to look beyond the obvious. That almost invisible thread leading to the truth was there all along, hidden in the coffee cup, in the scratch on the table, in an electronic message, or in the nervous look of a man who knew any mistake could seal his fate. Even today, when I come across seemingly straightforward cases, I remember that detail, that dried stain, and that scratch that made the difference. The experience taught me that in forensic medicine, as in life itself, patience and deep observation can reveal stories no one wants to tell and that only a keen eye can unravel, because in every small trace hides a universe of meanings, and in the most overwhelming silence, sometimes the truth screams, waiting to be heard. I don't know if this story will ever stop surprising me. Every time I remember it, I feel that lump in my throat that comes from discovering that behind the everyday hides a dark plot, that death can be the last messenger of terrible secrets, and that I, as a forensic expert, am its silent interpreter. And although in this case justice began to take its course, the greatest reward was understanding that obsession with detail, a critical eye, and patience can change everything. That truth is not a sudden blow or discovery, but a slow process, on the edge of despair, where only those who do not give up manage to glimpse the bottom of the abyss and return with something true. That is why, friends, I tell you never to underestimate the small things, the minimal clues that may seem irrelevant in my work. And I dare say in life, the devil is in the details. Because, as I learned in that puzzling case, it is not only a silent poison that kills, but the silence of those who do not want to see or do not know how to hear what objects, scenes, and those quiet moments try to tell. If this experience left me with anything, it is that truth is found, yes, but only when someone has the courage to see it, follow it, and not give up on what seems obvious, because reality is always more complex and darker than we think, and that complexity is, ultimately, the essence of our work and our constant quest. The days following the arrest became a constant exercise between patience and uncertainty. Every breakthrough seemed to open new doors while simultaneously revealing more shadows in the corners we believed were illuminated. Never before in my career had I faced a case where the pieces seemed to fit so well, and yet the puzzle remained with impossible hiding spots, where every truth appeared accompanied by a veil of doubt. The factory, that seemingly common and mundane place, became a secret theater of tensions, threats, and silences that manifested on its walls and machines like echoes of a hidden drama. With a clear confession and the suspect confined, the police managed to reinterrogate the employees with greater freedom, and, to my surprise, some gradually began to speak more openly. It wasn't so much bravery, but the weariness of maintaining constant pretense and the fear turning into desperation that led to these testimonies. Those who previously showed only fear and doubt now revealed conversations, movements, and even silent complicities we had never imagined. We discovered how certain department heads, aware of irregular practices, prefer to turn a blind eye to offenses that could jeopardize production and, consequently, their own jobs and salaries. The web was much broader and darker than it appeared at first glance. One of the most shocking revelations was a repeated mention of a special project, a kind of internal code employees use to refer to shipments and handling of certain chemical substances outside of official records. The arrested suspect had been just one piece, someone who tried to save himself while others, hidden in bureaucracy and shadow, used that channel to traffic materials that could endanger not only the victim, but the entire community. At that moment, I realized that man had been a victim of something much bigger than a simple labor conflict. He was a pawn in a game directed by invisible figures whose ambition stood above any law or conscience. With that idea in mind, I decided to delve even deeper into the documents found in the suspect's office. The handwritten notes that initially seemed chaotic and senseless began to take shape when I connected dates, quantities, and names with records of materials entering and leaving the factory. There were hours and days when certain substances mysteriously disappeared, always coinciding with strange movements in shifts and absences that, until then, no one had clearly been able to explain. This meticulous work was like assembling an invisible map, a cartography of corruption, showing not only the who, but the when and how. Meanwhile, media pressure began to build. The news of a poisoning death in a factory in Guadalajara became a topic of conversation, and although journalists were far from understanding the complexity of the case, they demanded quick answers. This created a tense atmosphere that didn't help, since between official statements and popular rumors, the truth risked getting lost in a sea of simplistic speculations. For my part, I remained calm and focused on work, aware that only a meticulous and patient analysis could close the open cracks and deliver justice, no matter how long the wait. During the nights, when silence took over my house, I clung to the details and photographs of the scene, searching for signs no one else had noticed. In one image, for example, I found almost invisible marks on the handle of the coffee cup, as if someone had hurriedly repositioned the object, which reinforced my hypothesis of a struggle. I also observed differences in the sheen of certain nearby objects that suggested last-minute tampering, a desperate attempt to erase traces. Each of these findings made me feel like an archaeologist in the middle of shifting terrain, forced to excavate with minimal precision, so as not to lose what could be the key evidence. But the element that shook me most deeply was what appeared when I reviewed the telephone and internal communication records more closely. There were contact lines not initially revealed, numbers saved under pseudonyms, messages hastily deleted. For a moment, I thought technology, sometimes seen as an ally, could also be a silent accomplice to the darkest secrets. Thanks to a data recovery app, we were able to retrieve fragmented conversations that revealed not only direct threats, but also a network of blackmail and corrupt information management handled from the highest offices. This not only raised the seriousness of the matter, but put people with enough power to alter the course of justice in check. That night, sitting in front of the screen, with the dim light and the clock already marking the early hours of Tuesday, I paused for a moment. I thought about the victim, that man whose lifeless body had come into my hands and who was now, through the evidence, beginning to regain his voice amidst the absolute silence. I thought about the pressure he must have felt, isolated and trapped in a place that should have been a source of work and livelihood, but had become a deadly trap. It was then that I understood our role as forensic experts transcended mere medical analysis. We are detectives of lives, guardians of the truth that tries to hide in the everyday. The next step was crucial. In coordination with the agents in the legal department, we requested a warrant to inspect the factory's oldest files, records no one had scrutinized closely, and that could presumably contain additional evidence. There, among physical documents and obsolete databases, contracts and agreements, signed in secret appeared, orders for the purchase of substances of dubious origin, and invoices that manipulated the real figures to conceal illegal movements. It was the tip of the iceberg, the definitive proof that this death was not an isolated incident, but the result of a chain of negligence, cover-ups, and an absolute lack of ethics. The network of corruption extended beyond the factory. We learned of implications in the regional distribution of those chemical products, connections with intermediaries, and warehouses that dissolved any easy trace. This revelation not only increased the magnitude of the case, but opened new fronts for investigation, putting authorities and the community itself on alert. Questions grew, and with them, the certainty that closing that circle would require much more than technical evidence. It would require courage, commitment, and the will to face collective darkness. Amid it all, the suspect spent his days oscillating between denial and resignation. Sometimes, during supervised visits, we barely exchanged words. But I recall one particular moment when one afternoon, while reviewing documents in the interrogation room, he looked up for just a second and said to me, with a subdued voice and a tone of defeat, "I am nothing more than a broken gear in this machine." That phrase hit me. Behind the criminality was a human being trapped in a network too complex for him alone. I wonder then how many times in similar cases we have seen fear become a prison and despair fatalism. With the full weight of the investigation on my shoulders, the final piece that closed the case then arrived. During a thorough review of a hard-to-access storage area in the factory, we found containers and bottles that didn't appear in inventories, hidden in unlabeled boxes. Upon analysis, the toxic substance was clear, identical to that found in the victim. Not only that, but one of the bottles had microscopic fingerprint remnants that we later confirmed belonged to the suspect himself. The evidence was indisputable. The death had been deliberately caused, from the very heart of the factory and with the complicity of silence. In those days, I felt on the verge of exhaustion, but also with the peace of having made justice a reality through science, observation, and constant work. The story was complete and ready to be presented in court, every detail perfectly woven. But beyond the legal outcome, I understood that the most important thing was to have given voice to a man who seemed invisible, to have unearthed the hidden truth in the dust and shadows of a factory full of secrets. Looking back as I write these lines, I feel that case marked before and after my career and in my way of understanding forensic work. Because ultimately, it was not just about analyzing corpses or evidence. It was about reconstructing human stories, shedding light in dark corners, and understanding that without patience and attention to detail, the truth gets lost in the noise of appearances. That is the message I want to leave you with, as a friend and professional who learned firsthand that justice is slow, difficult, and sometimes ungrateful, but worth it because it holds the voices of those who can no longer speak. So, if you ever find yourself facing a scene that seems simple, an event that appears inexplicable, or a detail that at first glance might seem insignificant, don't discard it. It could be that small crack through which the light filters, illuminating everything that was hidden. I learned this by looking at a dry stain, a scratch on a table, and listening to the silence. I learned that the truth does not always come with a roar, but with almost imperceptible whispers, and only those who know how to listen can bear witness to it. That is why every day when I enter a scene, I think of that case, that death that seemed routine, and ended up teaching me the importance of never letting what is in plain sight pass by, because in those minute details lies the whole story. And that, ultimately, is the essence of forensic work. Listening to what death wants to tell us and giving meaning to those voices silenced by life itself. The investigation had reached a critical point. But, as always happens in such complex cases, it seemed that just when we believed we had the definitive answer, reality pushed us to question every certainty and face new internal conflicts. It was not only the burden of the work, nor the external pressure. It was the unsettling feeling that we were touching something much deeper, something that resisted being uncovered because it involved not only the downfall of an individual, but an entirely stained system. Amid physical and mental exhaustion, I began to notice small details in conversations that reached my ears through different channels. Some employees, speaking in low voices and with distracted looks, talked about the fall as if it were an imminent event, a storm looming for anyone caught in those hidden networks. That made me sense that, beyond the strictly legal, there was a climate of collective fear, a fear that not only protected the guilty but kept everyone involved in a kind of tacit silence. It was an invisible pact, woven with threads of implicit threats, but perfectly understood. The following weeks required me to travel several times to the factory, not only to review evidence, but to discreetly talk with people who might provide one more detail, some confidence that would illuminate the path. I cannot deny that I felt a kind of growing tension, because with each testimony that seemed to bring clarity, new gaps appeared. Other characters whose identities began to emerge in the accumulated dust of those old files and forgotten boxes. The machine of corruption was much larger, more intertwined, and more perverse than I had initially expected. One afternoon, while reviewing some very old documents in a small storage room where barely any light entered, I found a series of internal letters that not only spoke of substance manipulation, but directly pointed to people holding high positions within the organization. They were not simple emails or quick messages. They were carefully drafted letters, with formal language but a clearly threatening undertone, ordering to keep the secret at all costs and warning of severe consequences for anyone who decided to break the chain. That evidence represented a turning point for me. We were facing not only corruption but systematic control and fear. What followed was almost cinematic in its complexity. We coordinated with the IT team for a thorough analysis of not only recent internal communications, but also those from years past. The work seemed endless and, at times, almost hopeless. We found countless draft hidden files and even encrypted conversations that only with patience and technology could we decipher. Among that data, a figure repeatedly appeared in conversations with other mid-level officials, a name until then off the official radar, a person who managed decisions from the shadows, with such power that their influence was invisible to almost everyone except those inside the core. That finding forced us to change the focus of the investigation. We were no longer looking for just an individual culprit, but dismantling a network. When I revealed this information to the team of prosecutors, I noticed a change in the attitude of the judicial process. The magnitude of the case made progress slower. Suddenly, it seemed that the system's darkest shadows were beginning to rise, trying to intimidate not only the investigators, but also the witnesses and affected families. Some anonymous calls arrived at our offices, and late at night I received cryptic messages that seemed more like warnings disguised as advice. It was a brutal reminder that this work, though necessary, is also dangerous. The forces opposing the truth do not hesitate to use any means to preserve their interests. It was during one of those sleepless nights when, reviewing one of the scene photographs with a magnifying glass, I noticed something that had previously escaped me. A small stain on the floor near the area where the coffee cup was found. The stain made no sense if we consider the official version. That man had not had recent contact with that part of space, and yet it was there, silent and forgotten. I began to analyze the layout in more detail, and suddenly, a new hypothesis opened before me. What if that initial admission, that well-crafted version, had been deliberately designed to hide something else? What if the victim had not only been manipulated, but forced to be in a specific place, so that his death seemed accidental, natural, even? That idea made me redouble my efforts and look at everything with new eyes. The next day, I cautiously presented those conclusions to the investigative team. The hypothesis caused a stir. Some looked skeptical, but it inevitably increased attention in the room, because it meant that what we believed closed was reopening, that the pieces could be rearranged in unexpected ways. Investigators began retracing steps, reviewing areas already taken for granted with new protocols. It was a time of constant revisions, debates among experts and lawyers, searching for details that only patience can reveal. While all this was happening, I felt the need to disconnect a bit from the whirlwind to process what we were experiencing. I walked around the factory's surroundings, observing that enormous complex that looked like a sleeping titan, with its chimneys and large windows that once only saw work and production. However, now those walls spoke of fear, of secrets that had corroded lives. I realized that the case was not just another file. It was a mirror of society itself, of its invisible cracks and how, sometimes, power and corruption feed on silence and impunity. But just as the investigation began to take a clearer path, something unexpected happened. A key witness, someone with crucial information to unravel the workings of the special project, disappeared without a trace. That event alarmed not only the investigative team, but also the victim's family, who saw the shadows spreading more intensely. That disappearance was a direct blow. Justice seemed to be fighting not only the truth, but forces seeking to prevent it from coming to light. That loss forced us to change strategy. We began working more closely with international organizations and security networks, trying to track any leads on that person's whereabouts or possible threats to others involved. It was a tense stage full of uncertainty and fear, where every move had to be calculated because the enemy was no longer just inside the factory, but seemed to span multiple levels of power. In those hours, more than ever, I understood how fragile the line between justice and darkness is. The technological investigation, however, continued its course, and thanks to a digital forensic analysis, we managed to recover data that spoke not only of the project's operations, but also of hidden payments, unexplained transfers, and banking movements indicating a complex and international financial network, far beyond what we initially imagined. The scope of the case grew, and that made the idea that the initial suspect was only a pawn even more plausible. We were dismantling a system that needed much more force and care to collapse. Despite everything, amid that endless tide of information, every small finding, a line in a document, a recovered message, a contradiction in a testimony, felt like a silent victory. We knew we were doing the right thing, that the path was tortuous and involved much more than a name or face, but we were also clear that, step by step, justice was beginning to make its way through lies and resignation. One night, already exhausted, while mentally reviewing the sequence of events, I stopped to think about the victim, that man who had entered the factory hoping to earn a living, who surely never imagined he would end up a piece in this macabre machinery. I wondered what he must have felt in his last moments, what fears or hopes accompanied him as he struggled against a fate that, for many, seemed long written. That thought reaffirmed my commitment to the truth and to the responsibility of the work we must do as those who explore the silence of death. Weeks passed, and little by little, the system began showing signs of surrender. Some names that had seemed untouchable started appearing in official investigations. Some previously ignored documents gained relevance. And with social and legal pressure, the network began shedding its most visible layers. However, I knew well that the process was far from over, and that justice sometimes requires not only evidence and testimonies, but courage and will to withstand the assaults of established power. What I learned during that time, and that stays with me today, is that forensic work is much more than analyzing bodies or scenes. It is a battle against oblivion and silence, against complicity and indifference. That case, with its depth and complexity, taught me that the truth is not always a straight line nor an act of sudden revelation, but a weave of small lights, fragments of hope that only those who observe carefully and don't give up in the face of confusion can gather to form a complete picture. It was a lesson in patience, humility, and unwavering commitment to justice. Looking back at that place that was so important to me, I realized that the factory still holds secrets despite everything. And I asked myself with some silent unease, are there more similar stories, more hidden voices waiting to be heard? Because death, though silent, keeps speaking to those who know how to stop and listen. And I, now more than ever, know that my work does not end when the body stops beating, but when the truth finds its way and is told. That is the essence of justice and memory, a legacy worthy effort, however hard, because in that effort lies the dignity of those who can no longer raise their voices, and the hope of those who still seek in the shadows. So, as I leave behind the scene of that case, with the feeling of having done my best but the certainty that the road continues, I am left with one last reflection I want to share. Never underestimate the power of details, no matter how small or insignificant they may seem. Many times, in those quiet whispers, in those discreet shadows, lies a key that opens doors that seem closed forever. That is what the death of that man taught me. And that is the lesson that, as a forensic professional and human being, I carry engraved forever in my soul. Because in the patient, honest, and constant search for the truth lies the justice that connects us with the deepest parts of our humanity. The pressure increased with each passing day, as if the very gravity of that mystery dragged us deeper into a sea of uncertainty and distrust. I remember spending endless hours in front of monitors and files, meticulously reviewing every fragment of information, every piece of data that seemed ordinary but, when read in the right context, began to take on a different meaning. What initially seemed like a single case had transformed into a complex system of control and manipulation, where the victim was just another cog, a silent observer who may have discovered something too dangerous to remain alive. The idea tormented me. What had that man seen or uncovered for his death to be not only suspicious but necessary to protect a secret? I mentally went over every detail of the scene again and again. That stain, so small and yet so significant, was like a crack in the official narrative, a crack through which the truth could slip if someone had the determination and the eye to see it. It was not simply an accidental spill, nor just a tribute to routine, but a clue suggesting that the victim had been in a place that those responsible for the cover-up had refused to acknowledge. What for many would have passed as a trifle, for me was a spark that reignited an invisible storm. The atmosphere in the factory had become almost unbearable. Every time I returned, I felt the walls watching me, the shadows forming figures only my tired mind could distinguish. The idea that some colleagues, some employees, were aware of truths we were just beginning to glimpse but dared not speak of for fear, both infuriated and saddened me. How many times had that pattern of silence repeated within those walls? How many secrets awaited disclosure, hidden by the constant threat of retaliation? I understood that forensic work is not just evidence and analysis, but also the nearly impossible task of opening spaces in invisible walls that protect corruption. One afternoon, I feared that tension would manifest in something concrete. When, leaving the factory, I noticed someone following me at a prudent distance. I couldn't make out the face in the darkness or identify their intentions, but I was certain it was neither coincidence nor a trick of mental exhaustion. I felt the weight of the threat that until then had only come in the form of cryptic messages and anonymous calls, now tangible and real, a distressing reminder that we were disturbing dangerous forces. I kept walking without changing my pace, and when I finally lost that person crowd, I returned to work with a mix of fear and renewed determination. If they wanted silence, we had to respond with truth. The disappearance of that key witness was another blow that seemed to drain any optimism from the air. In tense meetings, we analyzed every possible line of inquiry to find something, anything that might indicate their fate. It wasn't just a frustration of losing a vital piece of the puzzle, but the real terror that someone else might vanish if we pulled too hard on a thread. For that reason, we decided to join forces with external agencies, organizations experienced in witness protection and tracking dark movements. That led us to nights of surveillance, constant digital monitoring, and cross-referencing information with various institutions. The feeling was like playing a chess game where every move had to be measured carefully because the enemy had invisible and powerful pieces. Still, there were moments of encouraging progress. The retrieval of data from electronic devices allowed us to map out more clearly the network of payments and economic transfers underpinning that web of corruption. Seeing on screen millions moving between accounts and tax havens, around shell companies and phantom businesses, was like observing the map of a monster that grew and fed on every secret kept. The victim, and many others, had been sacrificed in that mechanism to keep intact a facade of normality and efficiency. I then understood why the initial version had to be so careful, so solid. Any crack could cause a total collapse. Amid all that complexity, a scene from our own office was etched in my memory. After hours without rest, gathered to evaluate a new analysis, someone casually remarked about the despair that investigating places where impunity seemed invincible could provoke. I felt a heavy silence take over the room. It was not just fatigue, but the awareness that despite technical successes, we were facing a system that defended itself with tooth and nail. But amid that silence, I clarified in a firm voice that it was precisely that silent struggle that defined our work. Because behind every document, behind every corpse, there was a story that deserved justice, and we could not fail. That dawn, while reviewing images and documents in detail, I discovered another small inconsistency in the official version. A reflection on a window that didn't match the time of death. A blurred footprint in a hallway unnoticed by anyone. A slight change in the position of an object that seemed to mean much more than it appeared. Those details made me consider that the victim had been constantly placed on a stage designed to tell a specific story, one nobody was supposed to question. I shuddered, because that revelation implied acknowledging that not only the system of power was rotten, but it had manipulated even death itself to protect itself. That week I returned to the factory with a fixed idea of better understanding the space and how someone could have orchestrated that scene. I walked every corner, observed every surface, and for the first time felt that place was not only a workplace, but a stage carefully prepared for macabre theater. I stopped in front of the coffee cup that had been forgotten so long at the scene and thought about what that simple object meant. Not just an interrupted routine, but a silent testimony to what lay behind every appearance. I thought about the person who had left that cup, their last apparently trivial action, and what that action might have meant in a moment of truth and betrayal. Conversations with employees, which at first had been limited to formal, cold interrogations, gradually became more human, though still filled with fear, uncertainty, and a strange hope. Some, with muted voices, began to reveal partial truths, disclosing small pieces of information that fit into a larger puzzle. That's when I realized that resistance wasn't only in documents or technology, but in the people themselves, in those workers who, despite fear, wanted the truth to come to light. But I also understood that every word spoken could be a risk, that every act of courage needed protection and support because the enemy was still lurking in the shadows. On long nights, while writing reports and reviewing testimonies, I became aware of how this case had transformed me. The dull, isolated routine of a forensic expert had become a constant struggle, not only against cold, silent death, but against a system wanting to keep injustice buried. Sometimes I wondered whether what we were doing was enough, whether those small victories would really open paths to justice, or if I was merely scratching the surface of a much larger iceberg. But then I remembered the victim's gaze and the photographs, the forgotten stain on the floor, the compromised message found among old letters, and I knew giving up was not an option. One of the most revealing moments came when, finally, we identified the person who until then had remained hidden behind the veil of the network, a man with influence and power who had pulled strings from the shadows, manipulating both victims and authorities. That discovery was like unearthing a dark den that seemed indestructible. However, far from feeling defeated by the magnitude of the enemy, that revelation gave us strength to continue. We understood that, to achieve justice, it was necessary to dismantle not only the individual, but the entire system that protected him. Every name discovered, every piece of evidence gathered, was another bullet in that unequal battle. The feeling of helplessness often mixed with flashes of hope. We knew we couldn't speed up the process or control the course of truth, but we also understood that truth, although slow, always found a way to emerge. Patience became our strongest ally, a virtue I learned to value as much as technical skill or scientific knowledge. Because it is not enough to discover the what or the how, we must also find a moment and manner in which justice can take shape without being trapped in fear or corruption. As the investigation progressed, I couldn't help but think about the families awaiting answers, the children growing up without a father, the friends and colleagues who never forgot. That human burden, that moral responsibility, was what gave meaning to endless hours and sleepless nights. I knew I could not fail them. Behind every corpse was a story of life in waiting, and my job was to deliver those stories to the world with clarity and respect, so that someday, perhaps, justice would be more than an empty word. With every step, the illusion of definitive resolution faded and approached at the same time. I understood that justice is not a destination but a winding path, full of obstacles, setbacks, and moments of doubt. And yet, amid that complexity, I felt a deep sense of purpose that transcended routine work. Because in the end, my role was not just to issue an opinion or submit a report. It was to be the guardian of voices no longer present, the canvas where those stories could come back to life and relevance. Therefore, when the case finally began to gain public visibility and certain names erupted in the press, I felt a strange relief mixed with fear. We knew the truth could no longer be completely hidden, but we also knew the battle was just beginning. Corruption was like a hydra that, when one head was cut off, gained new strength to keep fighting. Our work was not over, and I understood that this unfair and uneven struggle would be part of my daily life, because truth is not a gift received but a treasure conquered with patience, courage, and perseverance. Before leaving that place for the last time, I walked slowly among the dormant machines, touching the cold metal and breathing the dense air soaked with so many stories, so many truncated lives. I thought about how fragile justice is when it has no defenders and how powerful it can be when someone dares to seek, to ask, to disobey the imposed silence. I knew that case would stay with me, like a scar, a warning, and a constant reminder. Because in every detail, no matter how small, lies a key to opening the door to a world where truth and justice can be more than a distant ideal. That is how the story goes on. Out there, in every corner where corruption and impunity try to hide, waiting for someone with attentive eyes and a firm heart to discover, connect, and finally free those voices that deserve to be heard. And although the dawn may be dark and the night long, I know for certain that in patient searching, in silent and steady work, there's a flame that never goes out because it's a flame that upholds human dignity. Returning to the factory in the following weeks became more than just a routine. It was a journey to the center of a maze where every door I opened revealed darker and more complex corridors. The tension, far from diminishing, seemed to grow with every step I took. It wasn't just the emotional burden weighing down on me, but the increasingly palpable certainty that there were forces willing to do anything to protect their secrets. That pressure increased the risk, but also, in a strange way, awakened a kind of alertness in me that I had never experienced before. It was as if my senses sharpened, my observations became more meticulous, and patience, my strongest ally, turned into an indispensable tool to avoid mistakes that could be fatal. One night, after hours of reviewing recordings and comparing timelines, I detected a pattern that had previously gone unnoticed. Certain movements inside the factory, seemingly random details, coincided with financial transfers we had seen in those hidden accounts. It was a moment of silent revelation. It was neither coincidence nor carelessness, but a system orchestrated with precision to ensure that the money flowed without raising suspicion. This meant that the web was much deeper than we had imagined, and that the victim had been a weak link who had tried to break that cycle. What followed that discovery was no easier. If there was one thing I had learned, it was that the truth does not come alone, and when it begins to emerge, it brings a storm with it. I shared the finding with my closest colleagues, who shared the mixture of relief and concern. We knew that although we had made progress, confronting that system would neither be clean nor quick. Every piece of information had to be handled carefully, every step planned, because any oversight could mean not only the failure of the investigation, but also endangering our lives, and those who were slowly beginning to trust us to protect their stories. That very week, we held nocturnal meetings in different locations, far from the reach of unwanted ears. It was at one of those gatherings that we received information that sent a chill through me for a moment. An anonymous message, with apparently insignificant data, referred to a place inside the factory where, according to rumors, clandestine meetings were held and decisions were made that defined more than just the fate of employees. They spoke of power that interfered with justice, politics, and the local economy. That revelation opened a new line of investigation before us, one that involved even greater risks. But the commitment was clear. Knowing the truth was our only way forward, despite the danger. As we advanced, subtle tactics to divert or intimidate us also increased. We detected that some team members received calls, were followed, and even experienced minor sabotage to their vehicles or belongings, incidents that seemed small but could not be ignored in the context of the investigation. Paranoia began to settle in, and physical exhaustion competed with constant nerves. However, that night, when I decided to walk alone to the crime scene to better understand the space and potential manipulations, I felt that fear did not paralyze me, but pushed me to be more cautious and find creative solutions to maintain stability amid chaos. As I mentally reviewed every piece of evidence, the coffee cup forgotten at the scene returned more strongly to my mind. There was something about that cup that insisted it was not just a simple object. Its position, the dried liquid residue, even the type of cup spoke of routines rushed and distracted, typical of someone who did not expect their day to end that way. I thought that perhaps that small detail concealed something more. It was a silent testimony of a routine abruptly interrupted, and that made me imagine the victim's last moments, the thoughts they might have had, the fear that may have accompanied them without knowing exactly where it was leading. The interviews with employees also changed, not only in form but in the very essence of the relationship. Words began to flow, not with the coldness of an official interrogation, but with a mixture of reservation and hope. Finding mirrors in their uncertain eyes opened the doors to stories that previously seemed impossible to hear. Tales of forced silences, pressures that bent wills, and invisible efforts to maintain balance between fear and the desire for justice. The work was no longer just scientific or technical. it was human, and that factor completely changed the way I approached every piece of evidence, every testimony, every piece of data that came to me. One of those stories came accompanied by a simple but revealing gesture. An employee showed me a small battered notebook, where in cramped and uneven handwriting, they had written things that no one had wanted to hear. Those pages contained names, dates, and events that confirmed the complex network we were dismantling, but they also spoke of the personal price to be paid by those who decided to speak out. It was an intense moment, full of contradictions where courage and vulnerability intertwined. At that moment, I felt all the responsibility I carried on my shoulders. I could not and must not fail those voices, because behind that notebook were not only words but lives awaiting justice. Suddenly, an unexpected turn came with the appearance of a figure no one had considered before. A name mentioned constantly with fear and respect. A former employee who had disappeared years earlier, but whose shadow still haunted those hallways. Information about him was scarce and contradictory, but his hidden involvement began to clarify many doubts. He was a link that connected different spheres of the web, who had seen more than he could bear and, for that reason, was lost to oblivion. His emerging presence in the investigation gave us a new clue, an unexplored path that we approached with caution but renewed energy. The following weeks turned into a silent race against time and darkness. We knew that each advance could bring reprisals, but also that the void left by the victim, by the missing witness, had to be filled with truth and courage. We began to trace connections not only within the factory, but in the political and social network that ensured that this corrupt machinery continued running without interruption. What at first seemed like an isolated case had become a reflection of a sick system, fed by complicity and fear. That revelation, which would have demoralized anyone, pushed us to redouble our efforts. In those long, exhausting nights, when only the glow of the screen lit my face, I understood that the battle was also internal. We were not only facing external enemies, but doubts, fears, and a constant temptation to give up in the face of the magnitude of the challenge. But then I thought of that man, of his interrupted life, of the stain that must not be forgotten, and found in that memory the strength to keep going. No matter how dark the early morning was, nor how many times the path seemed to close, the truth deserved to be sought because behind every imposed silence, there was a story demanding justice. One morning, while organizing new evidence, we received news that shook the whole team. Important information had leaked to the local press. Names began to appear in headlines, and society was slowly waking up to the scandal we had had to carry in secret for so long. That visibility was both a victory and a risk. We knew that exposure could jeopardize both the corrupt and ourselves. But it was also a powerful reminder. Our work had already transcended the laboratory, that justice was not only a cold verdict, but a living process that needed everyone to move forward. Walking for the last time among the machines, I felt it clearly. That place was not only a scene of death and manipulation, but also a symbol of resistance, of the strength of those who, though fearful, decided to defy the imposed silence. Touching the cold metal, I felt I was touching more than a structure. I was connecting with the invisible courage of those who had fought from anonymity, so their stories wouldn't be lost. And although I knew the battle was far from over, I was sure of one thing. Details, no matter how small, had the power to change everything. A single detail could bring down a castle of lies. Thus, with the slow and steady step of someone who knows that the fight is not won in a day, I understood that my role as a forensic specialist went beyond analyzing bodies or scenes. It was to be a guardian of the truth, a tireless observer who had to guard those tiny details that no one wants to see, but that hide justice waiting to be freed. The story that began with a forgotten stain and a dead man turned into a lesson about the strength of patience, courage, and the human will to change the course of things. And as the shadows receded at dawn, I knew I would never stop searching, observing, because there in silent meticulousness lies the very essence of justice. Little by little, the investigation grew to a scale that exceeded any initial expectations. That ancient figure we had dusted off in the past not only connected dots, but also opened breaches in the network we once believed impenetrable. Every name that emerged from its dark history carried echoes of what had once been attempted to be buried. And with each step, the feeling of treading on minefield intensified. But this was not a path back. There was no room to abandon the search when the truth began to reveal itself with such clarity. However, this time uncertainty took on a more concrete and threatening form, because along with each new piece of information, invisible adversaries also appeared, playing intensely in the shadows. I remember clearly that dawn when an encrypted message arrived on one of our secure phones. It was a series of numbers and letters with no apparent meaning at first, but after analysis that unveiled a simple code used only by those of us involved in the case, it led us to a forgotten digital file on a remote server. Opening that file was like finding a key that unlocked a door long closed. There were documents, photographs, call records, and transactions that confirmed what we had already suspected. The victim had discovered a dark mechanism far beyond the factory, a network of influence that extended to officials, businessmen, and even social change agents. The magnitude was terrifying. That man had not only been a witness, but a gesture of defiance that would cost him dearly. The complexity left me stunned, not because I doubted corruption, but because I faced a reality that such an extensive network could function so effectively beneath the surface. We began tracing patterns in those communications, try to discover who the key links were, those indispensable pieces within the puzzle, and who were trying to extinguish any light that disrupted their control scheme. The investigation took on an almost obsessive pace, reviewing documents, testimonies, and recordings again and again, while monitoring our movements became the norm. At one such moment, while reviewing an intercepted conversation between two individuals, the tension skyrocketed. Their dialogue, filled with insinuations and veiled threats, indicated that our investigation had already touched sensitive nerves. It was no coincidence that the next day one of our collaborators disappeared for a few hours, offering vague excuses and showing obvious nervousness. The shadow of danger had ceased to be just a vague presence and manifested in every cautious gesture. Then, an unexpected turn appeared in the form of a chance encounter. One of the employees who had long kept distant, almost invisible, decided to give us something we could not ignore. She brought with her a discreet envelope containing papers with direct evidence of secret meetings, names of people up to that point unpunished, and payment labels made under front organizations. What impacted me deeply was not just the information, but the courage of that woman who, with a trembling voice, confessed to having lived years under a silence imposed by fear of retaliation. Listening to her, I understood that I was not alone in feeling that the truth was a dangerous burden, and that the small group we had formed had become an invisible bunker of resistance. It was a reminder that behind every piece of data are human beings with stories and emotions that give substance to justice. The days grew more difficult. Signs accumulated that we were touching a deep wound. Our emails began to be targeted by attacks, calls with silence on the other end, and an increasing display of external surveillance. One morning, upon arriving at my office, I found the lock forced, though nothing was missing. Only a cryptic message left on the desk. Stop digging or the next will be worse. It was a clear warning, an attempt to scare us, but instead of paralyzing us, it fueled that mixture of fear and determination that defines those who understand that the truth is not a game. I reflected a lot that day on how fragile the line separating justice from impunity is, and how, at that crossing, every decision involves a tangible risk. Despite everything, I decided to face that threat with the family of the case. We organized new meetings in even safer locations, even adopting coded communications to avoid leaks. The team, though tired, showed unusual strength knowing that behind every piece of collected data, there was a real possibility of change, of exposing those who had silenced voices for years. In one of those nightly meetings, while reviewing a crucial interview, we noticed a detail that had gone unnoticed, a temporal anomaly in the security cameras during the night of the crime. Upon investigating more, we discovered that part of that footage had been erased, using equipment and knowledge that only someone with internal access could handle. It was a brutal confirmation that the manipulation of the case had been premeditated from the beginning, and that the victim had been taken down not only physically, but also through the distortion of the truth. With that awareness, I returned to the crime scene once more. I walked to the factory's cold halls, my steps echoing on the walls with the sound of renewed determination. I remembered every detail. The forgotten cup that had raised so many questions, the position of the objects, the small marks that could be clues and not coincidences. That place, among gears and shadows, now seemed like a theatrical stage of betrayals, struggles, and broken silences. I saw the scene with different eyes, as if I could mentally reconstruct each movement, each decision of that last night, and understand that what had happened was only the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper mechanism. The connection between the documents, interviews, and physical evidence began forming a map pointing toward an unexpected figure. One of the high-ranking executives, someone whose influence extended beyond the factory to the highest political spheres of Guadalajara. This discovery represented a qualitative leap. It was no longer simply a criminal case. We were denouncing a web of power and corruption that intervened in justice to protect its interests, that explained every complication, every sabotage attempt, and also the reason why many employees had suffered threats or had become accomplices out of fear. The level of the network was greater than anyone could have imagined, making it clear we had to exercise the utmost caution. But here arose a troubling question: how to proceed when power is capable of manipulating not only facts, but also the narratives that reach society. We face an enemy that had buried lies with the same skill with which a victim is buried. The truth, then, had to shine with unquestionable clarity and irrefutable support. Thus, we reviewed the expert reports time and again, requested new autopsies and parallel studies, and prepared a report that left no room for doubt. It was no small task. It involved gathering external experts, rigorously protecting the evidence, and building a narrative so solid that even the most powerful could not undermine it. The responsibility was enormous, and every detail counted. The night we finished the final report, the atmosphere in the workroom was electric. Tired eyes, dry mouths, but also the promising feeling that at last we had something strong enough to strike a decisive blow to that opaque system. However, uncertainty persisted. Would the authorities participate in an investigation with the necessary integrity? Would there be mechanisms to protect those who spoke out? Or would it all be lost in some dark drawer? All that was beyond our control, but our task was clear: deliver the truth, without filters or concessions. In the following weeks, as the case gained public prominence and pressures of all kinds emerged, I kept alive a detail that first seemed anecdotal, but now revealed itself as fundamental: the cup at the scene. There was something about it that seemed like a hidden message. I recalled that in one of the notes from a notebook we had been given, there was a mention of that cup and an impromptu meeting the victim had with someone inside the factory. That meeting, we now knew, had been the trigger for his denunciation, and at the same time the beginning of his downfall. I decided to ask again those who had been near the scene, seeking any forgotten fragment of that dialogue, any stray word that might confirm hypotheses. That is how once again the surprise appeared. A voice that until then had remained on the sidelines dared to speak. It was the cleaning manager who that night had been in the area where the victim was found. His account was fragmented, full of pauses, but contained a key moment. He remembered hearing an intense argument, low and nervous voices, combined with the sound of hurried footsteps and a sharp blow that did not seem accidental. That, together with the testimony that someone had been watching the exit, led us to reconstruct what happened at dawn with greater precision. There was no room to go back. The scene that had seemed simple in initial analyses was full of hidden intentions and fatal decisions affecting many. With every piece that fit, with every story that emerged, I felt the importance of this work inside me, being a bridge between imposed silence and longed for justice. I knew not everyone could understand the sharp patience this profession demands, that calm gaze when everything wants a rush, that search in the smallest detail for the key to the biggest. But I also knew that there lay the real power, in those details that seemed insignificant to the world, but were the very essence of truth. Even today, as I pause to reflect on that case, I feel it was a ceremony of learning. I learned that fear can be both a motor and a prison, that courage does not always roar, but sometimes whispers in a way we choose not to remain silent. And above all, I understood that no burden is too heavy when we know that our task touches lives and builds a legacy beyond ourselves. Justice is not an arrival, but a path paved in the silence of patience and the clarity of vision. What began with forgotten stain, an abandoned cup, and a man who resisted fear became a silent beacon for those who still fight, for those who daily face injustice and invisible intermediaries. That story reminded me of something fundamental. In a world that tries to hide the truth, There will always be someone who seeks, who observes, who holds the light of justice in steady hands. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single detail changes everything. As we combed through every corner of the case, the atmosphere grew denser, heavier, as if each new discovery was a little harder to digest. It was clear we were poking into a nest of vipers, a network of interests so tangled that at times it seemed impossible not to get caught in it. What initially seemed like a simple accident or an isolated incident began to reveal far more dangerous elements. It involved political pressures, blackmail, shady agreements between actors who were supposedly meant to look after the common good, and a machine designed to crush any glimpse of truth. The feeling became more palpable with every meeting, every document we accessed clandestinely, and above all, in the uncomfortable silences of those who until then had remained silent out of fear or convenience. What truly changed the equation was understanding that the victim had not only stumbled upon corruption like anyone else, but had actually been a disruptive element, someone who dared to challenge the system from within. That forgotten cup, which at first seemed an irrelevant detail, was actually the silent witness of a conversation that triggered a fatal chain of events. The impromptu meeting, the palpable tension in the air, and the whistleblower's determination to expose what was hidden with a spark that ignited a dangerous fire. That last night, nothing was accidental, and every move was loaded with unexpected intentions. When the cleaner gave his testimony, although incomplete and full of gaps, it allowed us to mentally piece together a framework much closer to reality. Hushed, hurried voices, a sharp thud echoing in the silence of the night, a shadow watching the exit with the precision of a stalking hunter. It was in that reconstruction where I felt a different tension, an uncertainty that I didn't know where it would lead us, because each piece of information seemed not only to clarify the truth, but also to implicate more people than we could have imagined. The danger became tangible in the very walls of the factory, as if the ancient echoes of past betrayals were still resonating in an endless cycle. The team, and I decided it couldn't just be a loose fragment of scattered information. It was time to link every piece with concrete evidence, to reinforce the narrative with irrefutable data. We knew revealing this wouldn't come without a cost. There were forces that could maneuver from the shadows to silence voices, delegitimize evidence, and twist justice in their favor. The level of risk rose, but so did the certainty in our hearts about the importance of moving forward. That was when one of the forensic experts, someone with deep experience in complex cases, proposed something we hadn't considered until then, performing a specialized chemical analysis on the residues found in the cup and at the scene. Something capable of revealing microscopic traces that could resolve contradictions and open doors to new leads. We accepted without hesitation and, while waiting for the results, began gathering all documentary evidence, reconstructing timelines, cross-checking testimonies, looking for small errors in narratives that might indicate manipulation. The process was exhausting but essential. Each paper, each recording, every intercepted call became a link bringing us closer to the hidden truth. Meanwhile, the pressure increased. We received disturbing messages, not just encrypted anonymous ones, but veiled threats aimed at breaking our morale and sowing doubt. The night we decided to secure the information, transferring it to secure servers and creating encrypted backups, I felt that blend of paranoia and commitment that grows when you know you're playing a game with invisible rules. Finally, the analysis results arrived. They revealed something we hadn't sufficiently considered before. Traces of a toxic substance were found in the cup, an artisanal neurotoxin difficult to detect, and even more complex to trace in living organisms. But the doses found indicated a slow, calculated action. This made me urgently revisit the original forensic report and request new specialized autopsies. That's when one of the most chilling pieces of the puzzle emerged. The victim had been poisoned gradually. It wasn't a sudden blow, but a disguised act of aggression, camouflaged in routine, perhaps intended to appear as an accident or a natural heart attack. This not only explained the lack of obvious signs in the initial analysis, but changed the nature of our investigation. We went from a straightforward homicide to uncovering a systematic murder disguised under the veil of normality. This discovery brought an unexpected turn. We understood that our victim was only one of many targets in a much larger web, a network where silence served both to protect and condemn. Although the shock within the team was palpable, the immediate reaction was to tighten security measures, secure communications, limit access to information, and establish less conventional data exchange protocols. Every step we took was monitored. Every move could be intercepted, but our fight also became a constant strategy to stay one step ahead, vigilant not only of those inside the case, but also of those operating from power with resources to erase traces. At the same time, I decided to seek external support. I contacted colleagues from other cities and even abroad, experts in criminology and forensic toxicology, people with whom I had previously worked on complex cases. We needed a fresh and objective perspective, someone whose experience was not contaminated by local pressures or institutional ties. That collaboration was decisive. When sharing our hypothesis and evidence, we received not only confirmations, but also new perspectives and tools to delve even deeper into what was becoming a landmark case. It was a reminder of the value of collaboration and how, sometimes, a different viewpoint can reveal nuances unnoticed when one is too close. With that renewed energy, we re-interviewed witnesses, especially those who had been reluctant to speak or showed signs of fear. The most relevant of those interviews was with the personal assistant of one of the implicated executives, a young man who, after much insistence, confessed to having witnessed meetings outside official hours where sensitive topics and dark agreements were discussed as if they were normal. His account was a bridge that connected preliminary documents with concrete facts, shedding light on how the alibi existed not only in the physical scene, but also in the manipulation of records, testimonies, and even institutional control. However, his statement also made the magnitude of the risk evident. We knew that with the level of involvement we were dealing with, the safety of our team and informants was a top priority. Meanwhile, we informed independent media and investigative journalists that the case had taken a new direction, seeking to generate social pressure and avoid any attempt at cover-up going unnoticed. The media support reaffirmed that the information was solid and that the public deserved to know the truth, but also cast a spotlight that paradoxically put us in the eye of the storm. We began noticing strange movements around our homes, surveillance, suspicious vehicles, and increasingly direct intimidation tactics. The tension reached a point where we could no longer distinguish between surveillance and stalking. The line blurred. That made every meeting inspire a mixture of determination and anxiety because we knew everything could change in an instant. Despite this, we never lost focus. The pieces of the puzzle continued fitting together one after another, clearly showing the dark web that had been operating beneath the surface of our city. The evidence was overwhelming. Illicit payments, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, bribery of authorities. The executive's figure solidified as the main link between those corrupt worlds and also as the ultimate person responsible for what had happened that fateful night. That man, whose public image was an exemplary businessman, was in reality the architect of a system that had turned injustice into routine. However, the final blow that changed the course came unexpectedly. The brave employee who had handed us the crucial documents returned with something that seemed small but carried monumental weight. A fragment of conversation recorded on a device forgotten for months, hidden in a drawer. The recording was brief but was the irrefutable confirmation of how the murder had been planned and, most importantly, who was the instigator behind it all. Listening to it, I was overwhelmed with emotion but also with the realization that we now had the responsibility to act not only rigorously, but with surgical precision, because all that information could be everything we needed to confront those who had believed themselves untouchable for years. That was the moment I understood that although fear was still present and the threat remained latent, the truth acquired a transformative power impossible to ignore. We knew the path would still be long and full of obstacles, but in the light of that audio, in the certainty of every piece of evidence collected, it felt like we were opening a door no power could close. It was a rebirth of justice through patience, observation, and above all, the conviction that no detail is insignificant when seeking the truth. Therefore, looking back at that forgotten cup, at the almost banal scene where it all began, I think about how a single object, a tiny fragment of the puzzle, can change everything. Paraphrasing what I share with the team, justice is not a fire ignited with a quick spark, but a beacon built with patience, firmness, and a constant gaze that doesn't yield to fear or indifference. That case taught me that even in the darkest moments, the truth never disappears. It only waits for someone willing to seek it with calm and determination. Ending this story without closing the door completely is intentional because I know the struggle continues, that there are still open wounds and voices waiting to be heard. But I also know that thanks to that cup and the man who dared not to stay silent, there is now a trail of light for those who keep seeking justice despite adversity. That is a lesson I want to leave you with, friend, because in our work and in life, sometimes a single detail changes everything, and it is that detail that keeps hope alive. From that revelation onward, the atmosphere within the team changed completely. We were no longer simply unraveling a complicated case. We found ourselves in the midst of a battle where every step could define not only the truth, but our very lives. The scale of the corrupt network was far greater than we had imagined, but with the recording in hand, the final piece was beginning to take shape. However, the challenge was enormous. We could not afford a single mistake. It was a balance between moving forward cautiously and maintaining enough pressure for those responsible to know we were determined to get to the bottom of it. That phase forced us to be much more than forensic doctors. We became strategists, guardians of evidence, confidants, and in a way, victims subject to a threat that grew with each passing day. Unexpected visits to the laboratories, the sudden emergence of technical problems in our secure communications, and even silent phone calls formed a scenario where paranoia blended with tangible reality. But there was no turning back. It was as if we were on a tightrope, fully aware that any slight imbalance could topple us, yet fighting to maintain our footing, because we knew the depths of the pit we were digging into. I clearly remember the night we received an encrypted email from an unknown sender containing additional information linked to offshore bank accounts and irregular transfers. That night, in the dimness of the laboratory with the lights low and hum of fans, I felt something I had never experienced before. The real weight of holding not just data, but something capable of destroying reputations and shaking entire structures. At the same time, the security camera showed strange movements, shadows that seemed to lurk, unknown vehicles parked nearby. That reality heightened the feeling of being on the verge of triggering an earthquake. The audio, on the other hand, was crucial evidence, but we worked meticulously to authenticate it. We had to use sound analysis techniques to decipher even the slightest background noise, leaving no room for doubt. And with every second of progress, the gravity of the content became more evident. Direct orders, voices discussing risk elimination, cleaning up records, and above all, maintaining the network intact. It wasn't simply an isolated crime. It was an organized machinery meant to perpetuate a corrupt system fueled by fear and silence. We were striking at the very heart of that machinery, which made us vulnerable but also stronger. The dimension of the case took new turns when a contact within the prosecutor's office alerted us about internal moves aimed at discrediting our investigation. Someone who until then had remained in the shadows hinted that there would be efforts to dig up or manipulate previous autopsies, and that the same official had started maneuvers to question our credibility. That revelation forced us to accelerate building a solid case file, with an unbreakable chain of custody, and a strategy to protect both witnesses and team members. It was a moment when we understood we were facing not just a judicial case, but also a silent, invisible war among governments, interests, and power. The following days became a race against time. We contacted international human rights organizations and reputable investigative journalism outlets to increase public pressure, aware that exposure could be our best weapon and greatest vulnerability. But we also learned that not just any press would do. We needed allies who shared our commitment to the truth and could withstand the storm of threats and intimidation that would inevitably arise. With them, we designed a plan to release the information gradually, ensuring every piece was backed by irrefutable evidence and that no essential part was left out of narrative. However, the intensity escalated to limits none of us had foreseen. During a key meeting, the young assistant who had provided crucial testimony suffered a failed assassination attempt. It was a direct blow to our morale, but instead of freezing us, it pushed us to double our efforts. The hardest part was staying calm, because while danger lurked outside, inside the team's solidarity became a shield preventing fear from consuming us. We became guardians of each other, aware that any crack could weaken the structure we had built with so much care. Upon reviewing the recording once more and comparing it with intercepted emails, the plot took an unexpected twist. One of those identified as an active participant had left clues in his own communications, subtle contradictions evidencing a network absorbing responsibilities, a secondary network created to protect the true mastermind behind everything. This finding forced us to rethink our hypotheses and designed strategic interrogations that would expose those hidden connections. The case became even more complex, but in that complexity lay the certainty of providing justice not only with culprits, but with the full magnitude of the network, because only then could the cycle be broken. Amid so much tension, we still found moments to reflect on what we had learned through the entire process. It wasn't just a forensic investigation or a fight against corruption. It was a reminder that justice is fragile, that often depends on the will of few to uphold it against adverse currents. In those moments, each of us felt, perhaps more deeply than ever, the weight and responsibility of our role. It was a call to stay vigilant, to not let fear or despair gain ground. We knew the echoes of this case could resonate far beyond the offices where we worked because they revealed a system that, although proud of its facade, was corroded inside. As days became weeks, and the weeks brought us closer to concluding an investigation that seemed endless, I realized that the cup had not only witnessed a meeting, but was a cornerstone that unveiled the invisible gears of power. That object, so simple at first glance, had been the thread to pull to unravel a tangled web that in other hands might never have been touched. And although the final answer was still not clear, we felt we were building a path that could transform the very concept of justice in our environment. Because the truth we had brought to light had the power to question the entire structure that had denied it for so long. But let me tell you something, my friend, and that is that in this profession we have chosen, in this task that often seems lost or impossible, I learned that what really transforms is not speed nor spectacle, but steady patience and the gaze that never tires of observing. Justice, I tell you honestly, is a long-term, meticulous, and sometimes silent work. It is understanding that the small details, those that go unnoticed, can be the ones that change the fate of a life, a community, or even an entire country. And although sometimes darkness seems to envelop everything, there is that spark, that trace that is always there, waiting to be discovered by someone who does not give up. That is why, even now, as the case remains open and challenges continue to appear on the path, I cannot stop thinking about that cup, that scene on that night that at first seemed insignificant, because within it lies a lesson that transcends any case file or laboratory, that truth has the power of a river that persists, that seeps through, that finds cracks to come to light. And as long as there are those who seek it with honesty and courage, no power, no matter how great or fearsome, will be able to prevent the weight of justice from being felt. Perhaps this story will not end today nor in the coming weeks, but if anything is clear, it is how powerful a detail can be, because that detail not only marked before and after my career, but continues to be the beacon that guides our daily work. The reason we endure despite the storms and why. When asked what my most bewildering case was, I answered with conviction that, although it may seem small or irrelevant, a single moment, a single object can change everything and with it change history. And that, my friend, is what gives me hope.